Pedro's got the first one. We'll voice that over really quick, which is this was the research from the internal and external code review survey. So if you were an engineer at GitLab and you did this, or a person at GitLab and you did this, thank you. And then the external one. So Pedro's finished linking up insights, and there's a video overview that you can watch. So if you're interested in some of the results of those, take a look. It is some of what's driving the large MR work is the feedback we got back about large MRs in there and some sizing things from that. So there are some interesting things there, but there's also other work in there. So feel free to take a look. The next one is the big one that I wanted to put on the board for chatting. I don't have a good idea on how to do this one. I was thinking we could do it like we do our planning meeting, where everyone gets a few seconds to explain like which one, and we sort of quickly yay or nay them for thinking about in 14. But I don't know if that's the best way. But Andre, if you have thoughts, or Matt, if you have thoughts on if that works.
Sounds good.
Okay. And so the reason I put this here is one of the things that we need to do is figure out what we might do to accomplish the OKR. And while there are certain endpoints that we know might be problematic or other things that we want to look at, it is in order to get the gains we're looking at, we have to look at other solutions as well, particularly like in the memory area, like changing the endpoints is not going to reduce how much memory the pages load. That's sort of not how that works. So these are ideas. The first handful are mine, and then there's some others in here that look, I don't know who they're from, but the first one is merge request exclusions. And we talked about this in Slack, and I can find the Slack link, but essentially the idea with that, there is a subset of files, in particular in large MRs, these show up more often, where it's the code that's like vendored from Go. So every time you have to like rebuild the Go vendor library, like it also submits that in your merge request. I think like this would be equivalent to including like your vendor folder and like npm or your node modules folder like in a merge request, which would create a massive merge request of a bunch of code that you have no intent to review, because that's not how that works usually. So if we proactively excluded files, we could sort of reduce the payload of the merge request that's generated at first. I think we'd still have to provide a way to like see those files, but it's a possible way to do this. It is what other providers do, and the linguist gym, or the linguist, yeah, I think it's gym, supports, has some logic for like the types of things that fall into these categories that are not intended for humans, is what it's called.
Yeah, thanks, Kai. I think this one has anything that brings down the amount of files being rendered does improve performance. I would say that the argument here is that this will only affect a few MRs, so the MRs that do apply to that situation, and not a broad impact across all MRs. I still think it's worth it to consider it. There's some details that we would have to figure out. How do we choose which ones are not? I think we already talked about the implementation, and they should be still, to really reap the benefits of performance, they should be done on the back end, so that the back end doesn't even send the content of those files to the front end. But yeah, I think this would be a good thing for us to consider. It would help.
Sure. Do you think, just putting words in your mouth, potentially not initially though, right? Like potentially we should address it maybe after we get through the first few. Okay, got it.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Anyone has more thoughts on this one?
Yeah, anyone else?
Well, I was just wondering, we might need to create a mechanism to hide whole folders. Right now we can collapse a file, but from what I gathered, Kai, if you are committing vendor folder, it's going to be thousands or hundreds of files. And we at the moment don't have any way of collapsing the whole folders. So it might not be as quick win as we'd hope.
Okay. I think that's fine. I think the answer then on this one is, and I'm just gonna do this. Just after, okay. I'll just put that one down at the bottom, and we won't. At this time, we'll say the decision is we'll just address that one after the OKR work. The next one, I don't have a good answer. I don't have a good link. I don't know if there's an epic or an issue. One of the things that I think is true, and I wish Carrie was here to come and teach us all about diffs, but is that like diff generation goes through multiple layers in order to get to the front end, like where it's rendered, and then where it gets cached again. And we've talked about how, one of the problems here is that it's Rails code, and that can be a little bit slower, and that we sort of send, lots of data back and forth in all these places. And so one of the thoughts is, how much could we offload into Gitly to sort of like be responsible for all of the diff generation and giving us much more, like doing more of the work there. But I think there's a lot to dig into here, and I don't necessarily know what it would be. Nandri might know more about how diffs are done, but
I know my limited knowledge goes up to the border of the back end and front end, but I do have some visibility of that. We are addressing some of these problems on the source code side of things, where we're going with a different approach, where we're using Monaco on the front end, we're considering using Monaco on the front end to render the diffs based on the raw content from the server. I think that would make it easier, but it's such an unknown path forward that I wouldn't put us in our roadmap so far, just because Monaco would be a significant departure from the current implementation we have today on the front end, that we might get to it, but not right now, and it wouldn't be reaping the benefits within time for the OKR. Having said that, I think it would be definitely worth a spike, a specific spike, to have both front end, back end, and eventually someone from Gitly involved in a discussion. And having a spike would allow that time to be well spent. And even if we don't ship the improvement on 14.0, then we'll be able to work on something palpable on 14.1. So that would be my recommendation, to have a Gitly on this. Sorry, to have a spike on this Gitly issue.
you think during 14, like that
Yes.
we should put this on the list? Okay.
And I do say that with the mindfulness or the acknowledgement that some of this work could have been done before the milestone starts, outside of the milestone work. But I think having the ISCs involved in this is definitely valuable.
Okay. Matt, can you work with someone on the back end to like sort of define what we should look at or investigate in this, or have them validate if this is worth even doing? I don't want to put you on the spot and ask you to do that yet. Your tenure here yet, but yeah, if you can work with someone to like define this and create an issue that we could have for 14, is that fair?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I can do that. I've been here 2 days. That's fine.
Or you know all about how diffs are made.
Yep, exactly.
The next one is reload to change diff style. So this is the premise here. This is linked to an issue that says like the cog gets unresponsive in like a large MR, and like I'm proposing what you do is reload to change the diff style. And I think those two things are like wildly unrelated, but I've put them into one issue, and I should probably create a separate one for this. But the idea is, right now in our cog, you can make all of those settings changes to go from side-by-side to inline, or show or hide whitespace changes, or any of those other things on the fly. Like we will return that data back to you sort of instantaneously. The exception being the whitespace changes, because we don't have like, I don't think it's got to go fetch new diffs. But because of that, that means we have enough data in that initial load, or my presumption is we have enough data in that initial load to do all of those things. And so if, instead of doing it that way, we were to require you to reload the page and basically refetch everything you would need, we would cut down the payload and sort of the amount of logic on that page and all of these other things that are handling that for us. I don't know how true this is, and I put this as like, because we do a unified diff now, like I think we've cut some of that. I wonder if we ununified and went back to this, like if that would be, if there's a gain there. I don't know what the difference would be here, but I wanted to put it out there.
Thanks for the question. There's a lot of stuff to unpack here, but you're right. Since we unified the way that we represent the diffs, the benefit wouldn't be on the network side of things. They would be, though, on the processing side of things. So we had made that decision at the time, and we considered doing this at the time. And the reasoning that we did this is that very small MRs will just switch from inline to parallel very easily, right? There is a limit to when this stops being acceptable because it starts delaying a lot of, taking a lot of time. And it has to do with all the tearing down of components on the front end and then re-representing it from the same data in a different way. So the benefit here would be that the expectation from the user is, okay, I'm reloading the page. So in terms of timing, it might be the actual same. Perceived performance, though, it might be more acceptable to see the page reloading than the browser freezing. So that is the distinction here. There's a slight aspect to this, which is at this point, every time the user clicks an option, it triggers the update, whatever that is. One of the things we have talked in the past is that by adding a button to apply the changes, we'll be able to do more than one change at a time. So if the user wants to enable the Whitespace changes and switch to parallel all in one go, he has to click one, wait for the browser to come back, and then click again, and then have to wait again. So I think all of this play into the perceived performance of that little box. So I think if we do look into this, both of these things, having the button and trigger a reload, would improve the perceived performance, not necessarily the timing that it takes to do, with the mindfulness that it's still probably going to make it worse for small MRs. But for the benefit of large MRs, I think it's worth it. Those are my thoughts. Anyone has any others?
This is blasphemy at GitLab. We keep talking about how bad the performance is when we tear down a lot of things in the UI. It's very rare that we talk about why that is. I know, Andre, you and I have talked about this, but it is our framework. It is the framework that is causing that performance problem. Yes, there are a lot of DOM nodes in the browser, but the browser can generally handle a lot of DOM nodes. Our front-end framework is the reason that the performance of that is so bad when a lot changes at once. So just, I don't have a solution right now, but we do need to talk about those sorts of things sometimes.
Yep. Thanks, Thomas. I think that will apply to a more long-term vision of rewriting diffs in a better way. That in the parts of the discussions we're having are part of that more long-term. In the more short-term, I feel like this reload thing would be an acceptable way of dealing with it. But yes, in the medium to long-term, we're looking into ways to work around this cost of tearing down large sets of data. Thanks, though. That's useful. So bottom line, Kai, if it's that clear, I think we should still consider this for 14.0 to work on it. We do need some UX guidance, Sunjung, about how to handle this particularly, because the benefit will be perceived performance, and we will need some UX participation there too.
Yep, sure.
Make sense, Kai?
So, okay, I'll create over from current and then UX guidance. Well, we can work on the UX piece of this now and get an issue created, and then we'll tag you. Is this front end only? Yes, no, probably.
Yes. Front end only.
Andre, correct me if I'm wrong. The caching stuff that I was working on as a spike wouldn't have any impact here because we're not re-preparing the diffs that are already prepared. We're just trying to re-render them in a different way. Is that right?
Correct. Correct. Yeah.
Okay. The last one is improvements to whitespace changes. There's a bunch of things in this epic. I think the biggest one, and one that's like probably not up for discussion and something we need to do, is fix the batch diffs. I think the concern is that this potentially needs to be done on the Gitly side, and we're waiting on ZJ to get back to talk about this one. But I guess the other question is like, what, you know, this is one of those where we do generate multiple diffs, right? These are technically separate diffs, and we generate inline and side-by-side versions, or we generate the one unified diff of these. Are there other ways to think about this that we could do these things to, I don't know, get some performance gain out of these? There's a ton of UI inconsistencies related to this, because as it turns out, when you change the amount of white space you return, you've now changed the size of all the diffs, and that changes the limits that you might hit in a large MR, and different things can happen in that regard. And so there's a bunch of those things that we need to get to, but those are less performance related. So thoughts on this?
I would put this as a very high priority, just because what I wrote there is that the improvements we've shipped for the batch diffs have been life-changing for merge requests, and the users who always use this setting are not feeling it, and they're still living in the reality that we had a year and a half ago. So they're not experiencing that because of that potential of the problem that when we use this setting, it's not batched. So I know that there's the Gitly dependency. So whatever we need to do to sort this out, I would put this at a very high priority for fixing.
Is there anything beyond batch diffs that you think is worth looking at here?
Sorry, on what?
Is there any beyond batch diffs?
Beyond.
So like, yeah.
Kind of. So one of the problems we found when Phil was working on improvement on the batch diffs was that we could start triggering the batch diffs in parallel. But for us to be able to do that, we need to do an improvement so that we can assess order on the batch diffs. And that was a bottleneck. We needed backend implementation for that. So if we have the order, we can trigger 3 batches at a time, and we'll get to the end much quicker. Until we have the order, we have to do it in sequence, if that's clear enough. That will be the one technicality that I think we can improve on batch diffs without going into caching on the back end, caching Gitly. There's one crazy theory, Matt, by the way, I'll just sneak peek this because I want to talk to you about this on tomorrow, which is when we trigger a very large MR, you usually have like 5 batches. But from the moment you get hit the first, you know you're going to get the next 4. So I don't think we're doing any preemptive loading and caching for the future requests. So I think that could definitely boost the last batches. But I don't think we've done a lot of due diligence on that feasibility on it. But that would be something that I would definitely suggest looking into. Because it's one of those cases that you know you're going to get those requests within a second. So we could totally do some preemptive loading and caching.
You're on a server, you're saying, right? You would
Correct.
preload or something on the server.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an issue alone, I think. Just for that, the order will be another one, and the white space will be another one. So there's 3 issues here, Kai.
What's the third? Sorry, you said the preemptive loading.
So one issue for the order.
Oh, right. Okay. Yep. Got it.
One issue for the preemptive loading and one issue for the white space. I can create those issues later if you want.
Thomas, you asked a question. You can voice it over.
I'm not sure if it's necessarily worth talking about here live, but I can say it quickly. Andre, the diffs metadata that we get is not batched, I believe, and it has every file a metadata blob in the correct order. Can we not use that to identify the order of files in the batches?
I think we've stepped away from leveraging the front-end data to order the way the diffs are rendering, because that is a can of worms that would add a lot of complexity the way that we render the diffs. We can look into it, but I think that's part of the investigation of the order. But I do think when we looked into it, we realized the backend would give, if the backend gave us that, it would be far simpler to just put them. And we're looking for simpler on every time that we can here. But good call out though. I think we'll include that in the issue just to make sure that we don't do something that is not necessary. Okay, I think for the sake of time, I'll move to the next one. Anyone has any other topic here on this white space? All right, so briefly, one of the things that came up when assessing the 10K reference architecture site speed reports is that by loading the diffs tree list open by default, we're incurring in a lot of costly operations by default when rendering the MR. That's because we have to compute the file tree, we have to render it there, we have to compute a bunch of things to render the file tree. If it's not open by default, if it makes sense to the user that it's not open by default, that itself would be a performance boost. Now, we are very mindful, we don't want to game the performance metrics at the cost of user experience. So this is mostly a UX issue. And I think Pedro is already involved there to realize whether this would make sense to the user to open an MR without the file tree. One note there is that we already do open it closed if the viewport is narrow. So if it is, there's a certain magic number that we'll just not open it if it's below that number. The theory here is a lot of users are already experiencing that. So why not just make that for all screen sizes? And if they want to see the file tree, they have a very easy way to just open it. But by default, it would be closed. That would be a good performance boost because it would save us from that initial cost of rendering the file tree. Fair. Kai, you want to voice it?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think in a large MR, that's probably when you want the file tree the most. When you actually need to navigate files that have overflowed the screen, that's probably a piece that you want. So we need to be mindful. I quickly clicked into the issue, and I think Pedro seems to think it's hidden by default. Phil seems to think it's not. So we may just need to
it's
be
the
clear
viewport.
on where that is.
We looked a lot at this, and I think having the viewport at a certain size misleads us. But the screenshot I took is from the site speed. So the site speed loads by default all settings. It doesn't change any settings. The screenshot you see in the issue, it's taken from the site speed report at the size where it triggers that open by default.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. So that's the one. Can I go to the next one? All right. So this next one is about a theory that the feeling that the merge requests are slow go beyond the loading of a merge request with no options, with no other context. One of the most common cases is for you to follow a link to a discussion into an MR. Somebody shared the note, oh, I just updated this or something on Slack, or it's a very common use case to follow a link to the discussion, right? Now, what happens today is if your comment is at the end of the merge request at the last file, you have to wait for all the batches to load, all the files to render, and only then will the browser jump. We will wait for all this to happen, and only then will you jump to the right discussion. Now, we already have the API changes because Carrie shipped this recently for another feature where we can request a batch diff for a specific file. And so we would have to load the discussions. So the theory of this issue is that if you're pointing to one discussion, you know that the one discussion on the diff is only at one file. So you could skip all the batch diffs and you just load that one file directly. And I think that use case would immensely drop in terms of timing, and you would be immediately shown the comment that you're looking for at the potential cost of not showing all the other files solvable with a button, like load the rest of the files. And this is a pattern used on a bunch of UIs popular on the web. Imgur does that, Reddit does this. And it makes sense. If you're loading a link to one particular item on the page, why do you need to load all the rest? Once he reads that comment, he might want to go there, and we can facilitate that path. So I think this will improve the experience of a merge request being slow, going from, it just became much snappier all of a sudden. And that would be, in terms of complexity, not that complex because we already have things in place, but the win would be major on this use case. Not for the overall load of the page, but for this particular use case. So it might not address the metrics on the OKR, I just realized, but we're aiming to defeat that feeling that the MRs are slow. So I kind of just defeated myself, but I still think we should consider this. Thoughts?
What do you need to do this?
It's just front end. It's basically, I do need a UX guidance on how to display the call to action to render the rest of the diffs. Because right now we don't know how to show that. It would be very easy for us to only show that diff file and only show the discussions on that diff file. That would be easy enough for us to do, but we don't know how to display the option of, hey, you might want to load the rest of the diffs. Click here or something. That's a UX thing.
Yeah,
The
I
rest,
don't see any
we're clear.
downside of the user experience. Sorry, Andre, go ahead. I just interrupted you.
I interrupted you, so it's good.
Oh, okay. So I don't see any downside of like improving this. And I think you already proposed the UI here, and it's just a small UX change. Of course, I'm open to hear more opinion from Pedro, but I think it's a good issue to start.
Cool.
Thanks, Matt. We're up against time. We can punt the rest. There's a couple read-onlys. The last two I think are read-onlys, and then I will punt number 3, or we can talk about number 3 in the planning issue. So thanks everyone. That was fun.
It was. Thanks for promoting it.
Yeah.
Bye everyone.